Right. Hi, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Diana Alfuth, and I have been the horticulture outreach specialist for UW Extension for Fish, State, Pride, and Polk counties for the past 22 years. Oh, I'm retired. And so I don't go to the office anymore, but I still do stuff like this because I still consider myself a horticulture educator. People say, well, what's your like teach people about horticulture. And so I still do talk like this. And today we are talking about growing apples in your backyard. Okay, so this is not for orchard production. This is for backyard apples. And one of the things that, I'll say right off the bat, is that one of the things that frustrates me as a horticulturist and has been for years is and not that I'm necessarily criticizing, but it is frustrating, and that is horticulture is full of myths and folklore remedies and stuff that is not necessarily scientifically. And when I was a kid, growing up, my dad would come home with stuff, we used to call it barstool wisdom, okay? This Facebook wisdom, and so I lurk. Sometimes I can't have myself I reply, but mostly I lurk on these Wisconsin gardening Facebook groups and stuff, just to kind of see what kind of issues people are dealing with and stuff like that. And it's very frustrating when people post a question and they will get 20 answers. 19 and a half of them are wrong. And then, especially if it's a disease or insect, they'll get all these solutions, and a lot of them are wrong. And soil amendments is my biggest soapbox right now because everybody wants to put eggshells and tums and milk and coffee grounds and everything in their soil, and it's and, that goes along with specifically apples in the backyard. And I don't need to criticize what's going on these Facebook groups because I think it can be very helpful. It can be really helpful with ideas for trellises and plant ID and stuff like that. But when it gets to people saying, I heard that you should do this, that's when I get really, really nervous because where did you hear that? Okay. And so I'm really glad that you guys are here to know the actual, yeah, this is the way things should be. Okay. So we only have an hour, right? And for those of you who here, right? And I will keep it to an hour. But the thing is that we could talk about growing apples for hours, and we don't have that much time. So what I'm going to do is just touch on some of the basics of growing them, and then I'm going to spend a bigger focus on pests because that's usually in my job as extension what I get the questions about. It's fall and people are biting into their apples and they're all wormy or buggy or brown or whatever, and they're like, well, how can I fix this? And that's also why I see so much of on the social media is do this to prevent that, do this to prevent this. So that's the plan tonight. Okay, so to start, how many of you have a backyard apple tree or more? See, so you're mostly out here. You're that's the plan. Okay, good. But this is the best time to be here because have you seen the apple trees out there? They're starting to blossom, right? So we're it's a little early this year because of our, warm season and stuff. But we're right at the point where, okay, we got to be ready to be doing stuff. Okay. So first, selecting your apple tree. So for those of you who already have your apples, you might not care about this, but you might want to get your apple friend or you're going down to the nursery, right? So one of the questions I get all the time is, what's the best apple for me to get? And I can't tell you that, okay? Because my taste buds are different than yours, and you have to think about what it is that you're wanting that apple for? Do you want it for fresh eating, for the kids or grandkids to go out and take a nice bite of the apple? Are you looking to store them all into the Do you want to bake with them? I had pork with apples in it for dinner tonight, by the way, but they weren't all for apples. But you have to know what you want to use those apples for, and that will help you make the decision. There are hundreds to choose from, hundreds. And one of the things to keep in mind is Cross River, University of Minnesota, that way. Okay. They've done apple breeding for years. They have done a ton of releases of wonderful apples that are already here and grow well in Wisconsin. So you've got a lot to choose from. Now, the biggest thing to do is when you go and just do a Google, okay, apples for different uses, or you're going to find all kinds of things. Go to the website. You can also go to the University of Wisconsin Extension. Just Google UW Extension Horticulture, and you'll come to the University of Madison Horticulture Extension site. And then there is a publication in there called Horticulture for Northern Wisconsin. There's one for Southern Wisconsin too. We look up the northern one. And in there will be a whole bunch of different varieties of not just apples, but other kinds of fruits with little one in your local nursery is going to be a little more hard. Okay, so if you are shopping for apples, get out to those nurseries now. They're just opening up because there's going to be the best selection there. Do one that you and remember that you need two different varieties. Okay, so if you put in a Honeycrisp, you got to put something that's not a Honeycrisp in it because every Honeycrisp is genetically identical. So often on a tangent, which is why I always end up over when University of Minnesota bred Honeycrisp for Sweet Tango or any of their other great releases, they bring these trees and they roll them all out like hundreds and hundreds of trees, and then like it takes 6-7 years before they start producing fruit, and then they're trying. I went to the University of Minnesota for both my bachelor's and master's degrees, and every fall they would have some apples in the horticulture building that you could just take and eat because they were part of their breeding program. They had tons of all these extra apples. And when they do that breeding, some of these, so you can cross two trees, and they are, genetically, the pollen and stuff, but you get every seed has a little bit of a different combination, okay? So just like if you and your spouse have children, you might have 4 kids, but they're not identical, right? So it's the same kind of thing. You're combining the same genes, but they combine differently. So lo and behold, one of those hundreds and hundreds was promising and eventually became named Honeycrisp, okay? Every Honeycrisp tree was grown from a cutting off of that or a grafting off of that tree. You cannot breed the same two trees and get Honeycrisp again. So every single Honeycrisp is genetically the same and from that original tree. So you need what nature likes genetic recombination. They nature likes to get those traits combined and go through the survival of the fittest thing and stuff. And so if Honeycrisp pollen from one Honeycrisp the flower of another Honeycrisp, it will recognize it as its own pollen and it won't let it germinate and it won't pollinate. So so when you go, you have to make sure that you have your varieties, but you need more than one. The lucky thing too, though, is that crab apples, the ornamental crab apples that are all in bloom in town right now, they're apples, and they can pollinate a crab apple. So if you've got a herb, they can pollinate an apple. So if you've got a crab apple tree, it could be on your neighbors, it could be on, wherever. If it's within, 200 feet of your apple tree, you're probably going to get pollination because bees can fly that far. And the closer the better. And just to, ensure things, having two apple trees is a good thing, two different varieties. So the biggest thing when you go shopping for apples is to search for ones that say they are disease resistant. Now it won't say on the label which disease, but we all know they're talking about apple scab because apple scab is the biggest disease on apples and the biggest thing that's going to ruin your fruit. And so that's what they bred these trees for. So when you have done all these growing of all of these seedlings, the ones that have apple scab all over the leaves, they get pulled out. They're not going to go to market because nobody wants to buy a tree that is really diseased. Now, some of the really old varieties that have been around a long time, they don't have disease resistance. Okay, so if you have an older tree on your property, you might get apple scab bad in certain years. And we're going to talk about apple scab and controlling it later. But when you're selecting your new trees, get to whatever you want to do with those trees, whether it's baking or and pick ones that say disease resistant. So again, find a list of ones that you're interested in, and then you go to your local nursery and you see what they have in stock. Okay. If you wanted 5 of a particular variety or something, let's say you're putting in 20 backyard trees or something, talk to the nursery. They might be able to get the variety that you want. Okay. All right. Planting your apple trees is so important that you do it correctly because we want these trees to start producing fruit and give us fruit for 30, 40, 50, 60 years, right? Now, I will tell you that I have a ton of experience with rogue apple trees because the farm that we bought 22 years ago, it had been a dairy farm, old family dairy farm thing, but we're over by Spring Valley Elmwood. And so there's the waterways that start going. And so the cattle over all these hundreds of years, the cattle grazed in the waterways. It was too steep to plow and plant and stuff, right? Well, sometime about 100 years ago, a cow got a hold of an apple and pooped it out, and I literally have 1,000 apple trees, wild apple trees growing on our property. And it is amazing the nooks and crannies and crookedness and everything that they grow. And it's amazing the genetic diversity because in the spring you could see some of them are full of disease, some of them aren't. Some are full of insects, some of them aren't. Some of them you take a bite, they're called spitters. You can't even eat it, right? And some of them are really good. But there's a lot of different features that the apple breeders look for when they're bringing one to market, including when you take that bite, how long does it take to turn brown? Okay, some of them in my backyard, it's like seconds. You can see it as soon as that oxygen hits it, turns brown. And others, they've bricked them so that they don't turn brown right away because you don't like brown apples in your fruit salad, right? So there's a lot of different things, but the biggest thing is when you plant your trees, you need to plant them to be successful. Most soils are going to be okay with them unless you have really, really super hard pan clay. They don't like that. The roots just don't grow into it really well. If you have a more sandy soil, that's fine. Just know that you might need to do more fertilizer and water on a sandy soil than on a clay soil because it just doesn't hold on to that stuff as much. Okay, so make sure that you have well-drained soil. If it's a low spot where it puddles, they're not going to survive in that. Okay, it needs to get wet when it rains, and then that water needs to start dissipating so that oxygen can get to those roots as well. So you want well-drained soil and full sun. Full sun is defined as at least 6 hours of midday sun.
So if your tree is in a spot where it gets sun from 6 to 9 in the morning and 6 to 9 at night, it's not going to do well. Okay. And you're not going to get fruit. The tree's not necessarily going to die, but it won't blossom and get fruit if it doesn't get enough sun. So look for full sun. A lot of times I would get questions and people say, this tree used to always get fruit and now it doesn't get anything. Well, it turns out the trees around it have grown up over the years and now it's in shade. Yeah.
Do you mean the day from like 10 a.m. to 4?
Yeah. Yeah. Because that's when the sun is the strongest. And then you want to space them correctly. Now, most any trees that you're going to buy in a nursery are going to be dwarf. And that means that Honeycrisp bud or whatever variety it is was grafted onto a rootstock. So there are nursery growers that grow nothing but rootstock. So they're like little trees and they whack off their head and they sell just the roots. The rootstock can do several different things, but the main thing is that it'll control the size of the tree. So you can take a Honeycrisp stick, scion, and you can put it on one rootstock and that tree will only get 10 feet tall. You can put it on a different rootstock and it'll get 15 feet tall. You can put it on a different rootstock and it'll get 18 feet tall. Okay, so there are different rootstocks and you're not going to have that choice in your local greenhouse or nursery, right? But pretty much everybody is going to have dwarf trees. And they did that because we're short, right? We don't want to have to pick our apples on a big, scary ladder, but also for the urban environment, yards aren't big enough to have big, full-size standard trees like the wild ones growing in my pasture, okay? So they will be dwarf. It'll probably say that on the tag. Sometimes it'll say super dwarf, semi-dwarf, dwarf, but that's also going to be along with, it's going to say gets 8 to 10 feet tall. Whatever it says, it will want to get taller, trust me. But the big thing is that you want to, when you plant your trees, you want to make sure that what that label says, so if it says it spreads 12 feet wide, plan on 18 feet wide and plant your trees about 20 feet apart because we don't want the branches touching each other when the trees are mature because we need air circulation getting through there. That reduces the apple scab and other fungal diseases and things like that. So space your trees for what they're going to be at maturity. And yes, we're going to be doing pruning, but you don't want to have to prune. We want to prune for fruit production, not because they're too big for their space, because those two things would conflict. Okay. And then plant to the proper depth. So whenever you get a tree, so let's see, there's gonna be a, okay, where's
Top button.
Oh my God. Oh, there. Okay. So, so see this jog in this root system here? This is the root stock right here. And this is your apple variety of choice. So this is where it was grafted when it was really tiny. That root stock would have been about the width of a pencil when it was grafted, and they would have put either a scion, which would be a 4 or 5 inch stick, or just a bud on that. So this is your root graft, okay? That has to be well above ground. It's going to be about 8 inches above your first roots, okay? So very often I hear people say, oh, you got to plant it to the point of the root graft or bury the root graft. No, 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 no. Because if you're putting soil here, what can happen is this scion can start to grow roots. Okay, and then you lose the benefits of the rootstock. And while I said that most of the benefits are, or the main reason is for the size of the tree, it can also be imparting winter hardiness, some disease resistance, some other features as well. So you don't want to lose the benefits of your rootstock. And if there's soil up against this graft, it can actually hold moisture up against there and it can fail. So it can rot that scar tissue that made that graft, okay? So when you plant a tree, and it doesn't matter what kind of tree it is, whether it's an apple tree or a maple tree or anything, any kind of tree you buy in the nursery is likely going to be grafted because we're buying a variety. But no matter what, you want that soil level to be, you can see where this stick is there, way down there, just barely covering your roots. Okay, so don't bury that up to here. You want it way down there. One of the biggest problems that come back to haunt trees, whether it's, again, maples or anything, is that the tree was planted too deeply when it was first planted. Shallower is better than deeper, okay? Because these roots, again, need oxygen coming from the surface of the soil. And if you get them too deep, they can't breathe. They don't grow. All right. So plant them just above the roots. Then you're going to let them grow, okay? So when you first plant a tree, it takes about 3 years to be fully established. So you've probably heard one of the sayings, the first year it sleeps, the second year it creeps, the third year it leaps. There's some other ones as well. But when a tree is first planted, the first thing it needs to do is grow roots, because you need those roots to mine the soil for nutrients and water. And so we want to encourage that. You are not looking for fruit for a couple of years. By the way, the smaller the tree, the dwarfer the tree, the sooner it will start producing fruit. So a dwarf tree might start producing fruit in 3 years, whereas a standard sized tree might take 8 years before it starts flowering, producing fruit. So the smaller the tree, the sooner it will start to produce fruit. But that first couple years, you're looking at roots. You want to grow roots. Do not fertilize a tree for 1 year after you plant it, any kind of tree, not just fruit trees, because fertilizer typically is going to have nitrogen in it. Nitrogen causes leaves and top growth. We want root growth. Okay, so let that tree get established. There's plenty of phosphorus and potassium and all the minerals and what nitrogen is needed in the soil for that first year. Let it get established a little bit. After one growing season, then you can fertilize it. Okay. Otherwise, you want to make sure that you water that tree. If you're on sandier soil, that might mean that you're going and soaking that root zone every 3 days. If you're on a heavier soil, even when you first plant it, it's going to be every 4 to 5 days. You do not ever water a tree every day, because again, those roots need oxygen. And if you water every day, last year was so frustrating for me on the Facebook thing because it was a drought year and it was really hot, right? And people were saying that, oh, I watered my shrubs this morning and I watered them this evening too. It's like, no, you're killing them. There's no way the soil this far down where the roots are has dried out in a day. I don't care how hot and dry it was. It doesn't happen. So when in doubt, stick your finger down in the soil, and if it's dry, an inch down, you're ready to water. If it's still moist on the surface or a 1/4 inch down, you don't need to water yet. Okay. Many more trees are killed by overwatering than you think. So at first, you plant that tree. Let's say you go out and you plant your trees next week. Okay. You're watching the rain, okay, and have a bucket or a rain gauge or something out there to see how much natural water is falling on there. And otherwise, you want to water that tree every few days. And as time goes on, those root hairs are down there and they're starting to grow as fast as they can. And so as the summer goes, you can water less and less frequently. And then if there's a drought, even once it's established, and again, it's going to take 2 to 3 years for establishment, but if we have a drought, especially if you're on sandy soil, you're going to want to water that tree. If you have a tree that's been there for 10 years and we get the weather like we had last year when it was so hot and dry, every 2 weeks going and soaking that root zone, put a sprinkler on over the root zone, which is out, past the canopy of the tree and stuff, and letting it water is a really, really good thing. You don't have to do it any more than that, but you don't want it to get too drought stressed. Okay, the other thing that I see so many problems with is this grass and weeds right up against the trunks of the tree. Once a tree is big and old like this and established, it's not as big of a deal. But a younger tree, grass is super highly competitive with trees. The grass will take the water and the nutrients out of that soil before the tree gets it. So make sure that when you plant that tree, you leave a grass-free zone, like a big diameter, put some mulch on it and keep the grass from growing up and competing with those roots, at least for the first couple of years. And the other thing is, if you keep that grass away, you're less likely going to get rabbits and voles and stuff in there chewing on that bark. So as soon as you plant your tree, and I forgot to put that on my slide here, make sure that you do some protection over winter with hardware cloth or the tough plastic stuff, because mice and rabbits will eat that bark and they'll girdle your tree and they will kill it. Yes.
So is there like a formula for the diameter of mulch with respect to the height of the tree or the width of the tree?
That's a really good question. A formula for the diameter. So think about when you first plant the tree. Okay, so like if we go back to this, ideally we would have a circle of mulch at least this big covering all of those roots, because we don't want the grass to come in and be growing over these roots and competing with it. There's not really a formula. There reaches a point. So a tree's roots, whether it's an apple or a maple or whatever else, a tree's roots will grow out 2 to 3 times the height of the tree, which means if you have a 50-foot tall river birch, those roots could easily be out 100 feet. You're not going to put a mulch ring that big around it, okay? So there's a limit to it. Now, there is under a fruit tree, there are some advantages to a nice big mulch ring, even after it starts producing, because apples fall and you got to do some cleanup, which we'll talk about. But it's, there's a limit, okay? So there's not really a formula, but for the first couple years, the first year you got a root zone this big, those roots will go out about a couple more feet in the first couple years, and then the tree's considered established. So it can still go under the existing grass there and stuff. So not an easy formula. Yeah.
I heard that you shouldn't, when you're mulching, mulch up on the tree. You want to make sure the mulch is away from the trunk.
Think donut, not volcano.
Right.
And that goes back to what I was talking about here. If you put mulch up against this is trunk bark. It's not root bark. And if you put mulch up against this, it holds the moisture in there and that can rot. Okay. So you always want about it where the trunk comes down about an inch, and then you mound your mulch up over there. Now, some of it gets kicked up there, eventually, but yeah, it's hard. You're driving through and somebody's put volcanoes by their trees and it's like, I just want to stop. But that's a very, very good point. Okay, so again, don't fertilize a newly planted tree. We want it to establish roots. We don't want a lot of nitrogen. Once it's established, you can, after that first year, you can give it a shot of fertilizer, maybe the second year. Once the tree's established, if it's putting on at least 12 inches of growth on the ends of the branches every year, it's getting enough nutrients. We don't want to over fertilize trees, especially with nitrogen, because what that does is it causes a whole lot of top growth that isn't always very strong, a whole lot of leaves at the expense of flowers once it's wanting to flower and stuff. And it's like a kid on sugar. You don't want too much nitrogen in there. So depending on how fertile your soil is, you may not need to fertilize your trees after they're, in the ground for 5 years. If the trees are putting on growth, they've got enough. Okay. If you're on a sandy soil, you might need to fertilize more often. And the way that you fertilize is to use a granular fertilizer, or you can use a liquid fertilizer and just put it all over the root zone of that tree, like pretty much under the canopy. Those tree spikes that you get, those fertilizer spikes, don't use them because they dissolve only where the spike is. They don't go out all over where the roots are. You pound them in. The fertilizer goes down, it doesn't go outward. And when you fertilize, you want to fertilize in the spring when the new growth is starting. Never fertilize after the 4th of July, because at the 4th of July, you'll notice that on any of the trees, they stop getting new leaves, because after June 21st, they sense that the days are getting shorter and they start thinking, we got to get ready for winter. And so if you fertilize after the 4th of July, you're causing new growth that doesn't always harden off well by the time winter comes. And that's another problem with the spikes. They don't always dissolve before the 4th of July, and then you can get dieback on your branches if they don't harden off enough.
What about low nitrogen fertilizer?
Okay, so I'm going to tell you, ideally, before you plant, you do a soil test, okay? And send one into a lab. Don't bother with the little over-the-counter things, because accuracy is not great. Plus, they don't give you any recommendations on what to do, depending on your results. So send it into the lab. University of Wisconsin soil lab, it's $15 for a soil test. I highly recommend it. Mainly, it's going to tell you your pH, and pH is important because if your pH is too far out of whack, one way or another, it can affect a plant's ability to take nutrients out of the soil. So, for example, if your pH is really high, plants have a hard time taking iron out of the soil. And so you might have iron deficiency symptoms, even though there's plenty of iron in the soil. Okay, so a soil test is going to tell you. The thing is that in most cases, and especially if you're putting mulch on top, if you've got decent soil that has a decent amount of organic matter in it, you've probably got enough phosphorus and potassium and all the trace minerals in there. Okay, but starting with a soil test to tell you for sure is important. Yeah. Okay, so let's talk a bit about pruning here quick. We prune apple trees differently than your yard trees. Okay, we want our maples and trees in the yard to look nice, have this nice central leader and this nice shape and everything. That is not the case for apples. We want to prune them for maximum fruit production, and we need to create a good structure for that. We also want to prune them in a nice open form so that air blows through it, because fungal diseases, apple scab, they need moisture to take hold. And so the more air circulation, the faster leaves and fruits dry off, so less conducive to getting diseases in there. We can also prune, and in a homeowner situation, I don't know how much you really want to get into this, but the orchards do it. They prune to limit fruit production. So how many of you who had apples last year had a ton of apples on your tree? Last year was an amazing year for apples. And it was because in spring we warmed up so fast. When it bloomed, the pollinators were all out, and pollination was crazy last year. And so there were tons of apples last year. This year, don't expect that many apples, because the tree spent a lot of energy growing all those apples last year, and so they'll probably take a rest this year. So if you don't have any apples this year, that's why. Okay, but orchards, they need to have a good supply of apples every year, because that's, they need to have them to sell. So they will prune so that they're pruning away some flower buds every year, so that they don't get the heavy year followed by the non-year sort of a thing. We don't care what a fruit tree looks like. Now, if you live in town and it's in your front yard, that might be a little hard to reconcile, but this is not a pretty looking tree, but it's a great tree for fruit production. So when we prune apples, they're going to look ugly. Always remember that pruning causes growth. So when you prune something away, whether it's an apple tree or anything else, it's gonna shoot back with some kind of growth somewhere. So you have to be thinking when you do the pruning, where is that growth going to occur? And it shoots back because a plant is always wanting to be in balance with the canopy and the root system. You take off some of the canopy, you've got excess root system, poof, it grows back. Okay. So recognize that at the end of every branch, there's an apical bud, and that controls all the buds that are farther back. So at the base of every leaf, there's a bud, and it's just sitting there, and it doesn't grow until this guy disappears and lets them grow. And it's all about hormones that go through and stuff. But if you have a house plant and you pinch the tip of the vine, it branches out more, right? Because it releases the next bud. So it'll be like this. And it might release the next ones too, but the next one's done, might just stay there. So this is something to keep in mind. Where is that growth going to be? Fruit on apples does not form on vertical branches. So if you have a tree like this, see how all these branches are going straight up? There are never going to be any apples on that stuff. You get your apples on branches that are horizontal and basking in the sun. Okay, so that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to stop or prune away the upright growth and cause things to grow outward. Now, with apples, they have alternate um, budding, alternate growth. So when you look at this, there's like this bud goes to the right, this bud goes to the left, to the right, to the left. Okay. So if you prune right here, if you're pruning off that apical bud that's way up there, that's going to cause this bud to shoot out that way. So whenever you prune, if you're pruning these, we want to whack these off because we don't want them growing up anymore. Not only is that going to get too tall, but that's not going to produce fruit anyway. So we would prune back these right above a bud that's pointing outward because that's where that next branch is going to grow. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So on young trees, something like this, there's way too many branches in there. We need to open it up a little bit and we have to figure out which ones are we going to tell to grow outward and become that ugly looking tree that we're looking for. Okay. So always look for an outside bud. And this is really what we're looking for, is more of a vase shape. So that stuff in the middle, that central leader that you want on your maple tree in your yard, goes. Okay, that's one of the first things that you're getting out of there. And then you can see, like this branch, all of the stuff that was pointing inward has been removed. And the branches that are allowed to grow are going outward because this is where our apples are going to form. Okay? Anybody question? Yes.
Central leader.
Exactly. Okay, because the central leader is just going to shade everything out and it's going straight up and down, and fruit does not form on straight up and down stuff. Okay, you do not want a central leader. You want this kind of vase sort of a thing. All right, so as the tree grows, you want to maintain this openness in the middle. And what will happen, because pruning causes growth, you will get things called water sprouts. And you've probably all seen them, but it's like, okay, you've got your branch here, and then you'll have the branch that goes straight up out of those things. Okay, those are water sprouts. Clean them out every year. You will get them. That's just what apple trees do. They will grow every year. They are the best thing if you're doing grafting. Those water sprouts are great to use for grafting, but you don't want them in there because they're growing straight up. They're not ever going to produce fruit. And what they're going to do is cause a lot of shade.
And water sprouts, like with other trimming you want to do in winter in like February, March.
The best time to prune apples is going to be when everything is dormant and cold. So February and March is ideally the best place. All of the energy is stored in the roots for winter, fall color change and stuff. All that energy has gone down into the roots. It's dormant. And more importantly, the diseases and insects that bother apples are dormant. So you're making a wound when you do a pruning cut. You're opening up the center of the tree, and the sap and all that kind of thing can attract pests. So February and March are usually the best time. Now, having said that, okay, if you're, in Arizona in February and March, and you don't get back in time, as long as they've not like leafed out yet, you're still fine. Or if you need to prune in November before you go to Arizona, that's fine too. Okay, it's just the ideal time is usually February, March. Okay, so any of this stuff that shoots straight up, you get it out of there and you cut it right back to the branch where it starts. So the open canopy is going to do a couple of things. It's going to let sunlight into the middle. And remember, apples are full sun. And if they're in the shade, they don't flower and they don't produce fruit. So we want fruit forming in this part of the tree as well as out on the edges. So that's part of it, okay? And then again, it lets that breezes blow through there and the air circulation, which reduces humidity, which reduces fungal disease. So a tree's shade is its own worst enemy. So you can see by this picture that the stuff that's on the outside, it's getting 60 to 100% of full sun, but down here in the middle, it's in deep shade. Okay, we want to avoid that as much as possible. We want as much sun to get in there as we can. So there are a couple of ways you can evaluate. Can you see through the tree? When you're done pruning, or even when it's got leaves on it, you should be able to see through that tree. Okay, this tree right here, look at all those water sprouts. Isn't that awful? The reason that it's got all those waterfalls is somebody sheared this tree. They basically went through and they just cut everything off into a little bit of a mushroom shape here. See that? This is where they did all the pruning. So they basically made the tree smaller, and all those water sprouts will grow up from that. Okay, look at the shade, even without leaves in that tree. That tree is not going to produce any fruit. Okay, but this is, see how you can see through that tree, even once there are leaves on it. Another way is, can the bird fly through the tree? Okay, your canopy should be that open that a bird could come going through, go right through the canopy and keep on going. If you don't think the bird can make it through there, keep pruning. Another thing is if there's dense masses of limbs. So sometimes we, start out and we've got little branches and we think, oh, everything is fine. But remember, all of those branches get fatter every year. And eventually we've got stuff pushing on each other and that. So you have to make a tough decision at some point, take some of that out. Okay. And then are there windows of light that get down into the middle of it? And then my favorite is to use the sky test. So this is what one of my college professors said, that when you're done pruning, you lay down with your head right by the trunk and look up through the tree and make sure you can see the sky. If you can't see the sky, get up and prune some more away. Okay. So it seems drastic, but it's a different way of pruning than with a maple or something. Okay, so the apple trees, the first year when they're growing, the branch is going to look like this. And see these little buds? Those are vegetative buds. Those are leaf buds. Okay, so they're only ever going to form leaf. But on the second year, okay, so this spring, little branch like this grows. Next year, that branch is going to form these little spurs, and this is a flower bud. So see how fatter and fuzzier it looks? That's a flower bud. So that's what's going to flower and produce food the next year, so on year 3. So when you're doing your pruning, you're going to be looking at, where are these buds? And you have to, sometimes it's like, oh, I really got to prune that branch, but I'm pruning away 6 apples. You got to do it. Okay, so there's a balance of pruning there. The thing is, don't worry, you're not going to kill your tree. People are very afraid to prune sometimes, but you're not going to kill your tree. Okay, you might lose a few apples. It might need to recover for a year or something, but you're not going to kill your tree by pruning unless you prune everything right back to the trunk. right? So don't worry about that. And if these little spurs are out there in the sun and everything is good, they're going to produce apples every year. And so you'll get a cluster of flowers there and a cluster of apples, and all is good. So we've got a few minutes here. I'm going to talk about the major pests, because this is one of the biggest things that I would get questions about, and that there's a lot of confusion of. It's not easy to grow the perfect apple in Wisconsin. That's why most apples are produced like over in Oregon and Washington and stuff, because they don't have the humid summers that we have. But there are 3 main insects and 1 disease that are the biggest things that we worry about here. And anything else is really, really rare. Okay, so plum curculio, codling moth, and apple maggot are the insects. I'm going to go through all of them, and then apple scab, which you've heard me mention already. So one thing to keep in mind is that with apples, it's the larvae of these insects that do the damage and damage the fruit. Once a larva is in the fruit, you can't do anything about it. Okay, you can't get a spray in your apple. You wouldn't want to. So we have to prevent that in the first place. So this is plum curculio. It's a little weevil kind of looking thing with this snout. It's native. It's tiny, about 1/4 of an inch. It overwinters not on the tree. And this is one thing that I want you to note on all of these insects. For the most part, they do not overwinter on the trees. Okay, a little bit, okay. But when you see recommendations to spray your tree with dormant oil spray, don't bother, because it will not have any effect on these insects that damage the fruit. Okay, but we see that out there, maybe in Florida, okay, but not in Wisconsin. So they overwinter in wooded areas. So they're going to be, if this camera stand here is the apple tree, they're going to overwinter in the woods over there, under the leaf litter over there, that kind of a thing. And they overwinter, and then they come out in spring, usually 2 to 5 weeks after the end of bloom. And they get up there and they will make these little crescent-shaped slits in the apple skin, and these apples are going to be about the size of a dime at this point. Okay, so it's not long after the petals have fallen and the fruit is just starting to form. They make these little slits, they lay their egg under there. The eggs hatch about a week later. Now, the weird thing about plum curculio is it's a much bigger problem on plums or cherries even than it is in apples, because most of them die, because as the larva just gets into the fruit, as that apple fruit, because apple fruit is so firm as it's growing, it squishes and kills the plum curculio larva. So the only ones that really survive are if the apple falls to the ground, which it might, because trees will self-thin if they have too much fruit or that. And then the fruit that's on the ground, it's not growing anymore, so it can continue to develop. Okay, but they do develop in plums and cherries because that fruit isn't so dense. So if the fruit doesn't fall off or anything, the insect dies, you might see these little dents, and later in the season they'll look like these little half circles, and that just says that plum curculio tried to get in spring. It really didn't. It's not a big deal. Okay, yeah.
So if you had an apple tree that had some kind of symptoms like this, but you also have a cherry tree, and the cherry tree didn't have any issues or any of these scars or any fruit damage, it probably wouldn't be this insect.
No, it could be, because some cherries are going to be resistant,
Okay.
and there's different factors too, that just on timing and stuff too.
Okay.
But plum curculio is out there, but if you were selling apples, this would be a problem. In your backyard apple tree, this is not a problem at all, right? You bite around it. It does not go below the skin. Okay. So later in the year, there's a second generation, and some of the adults can come out and they can chew on some fruit and make little holes like that. Okay, the biggest thing is, and you're gonna hear me say this multiple times, pick up fallen fruit in summer. Okay, there's no real way to trap or monitor for plum curculio, but it is, again, mostly a minor pest, unless for some reason you have built up a massive population in your backyard, but probably not a big concern. Okay, and you can see here's the tiny little apple forming, and there's the little crescent thing again. So if you're concerned about plum curculio, you start looking at your baby apples when they're this big. You can also like put a sheet down and tap the branches, and if there's plum curculio in there, they'll fall to the ground and you'll find them. Okay, most of the time, like until it's 70 degrees, when these adults are coming from the woods, they only walk. They can't fly until it's over 70 degrees. So it's kind of a slow event. All right, cobbling moth is a much bigger problem. And this is a little moth. Again, it's little, it's a half-inch long. You probably never going to see the adults unless you're really looking at them. They overwinter as cocoons, mostly in leaf litter or, somewhere nearby. They can be on a tree. If it's an older tree that has some loose and flaky bark, they'll go under that bark. Okay, and they'll overwinter actually on the tree. But dormant oil spray isn't going to help anyway, because you've got to get the oil behind the bark and on these things to smother them. That's what dormant oil does. So don't worry about that. Okay, but they will overwinter as cocoons. They come out during full bloom. So they're like starting to come out right now, and they will fly around. Their adults are around for about 8 weeks. And what they do is they lay their eggs either on or right next to the developing little fruit. And then the little larvae, which again are about a half an inch, well, they're even smaller at this stage. They're like, gosh, you can't really hardly even see them. And they'll kind of walk around and just feed on surface stuff for a little bit. And then they burrow into the fruit. And what they do is they feed for 3 to 4 weeks. And then very often, because the fruit is so damaged, the fruit falls to the ground. And then they crawl out of that fruit and they drop down to the ground and they pupate. Okay, but they've already ruined your fruit. And then there's a second flight a second generation that will come out later in the year, but usually they don't cause much damage. They could, depending on how many of them are, but it's really the first generation that's the problem. They will, again, that little larva will try to get in. If they are not successful, they'll leave these tiny little scars that are called stinks. And so if you've got, your ripe apples in the fall and you're picking them and you've got some of these little things, it's like cobbling moth tried to get in there way back in spring, didn't make it, no big deal. Okay. But the ones that do get in do this. They head to the core and they feed on the flesh and the seeds. This is the proverbial worm in the apple. Okay. And so when they damage all of this, the tree recognizes that, the seeds have been damaged. They're not going to reproduce. Heck, I'm not going to waste any more time. And it drops that fruit down to the ground. So it's really, really important that when you have fruits falling to the ground in summer, pick them up and get rid of them. And you can either bury them at least a foot deep, throw them in your trash, whatever. But if you just let those fruits lay on the ground, these guys will continue to develop. They'll crawl out and they'll pupate, and then you'll have more problems. Sure. Dear help. Yes, they can be. They can be. But I will tell you, with my 1,000 apple trees, there were so many apples last year. There's still apples laying on the ground rotting. They can only eat so many. Yeah.
You probably don't want to throw them in your compost then, if you're going to put your compost by your.
You don't want them at least on the surface of your compost. If they're buried down in at least a foot down, that will kill the larva because they're not getting. Yeah, but yeah, you don't want to just put them on a pile. Okay, so there are sprays that can control this, both organic and non-organic. What you're basically trying to do is to kill the larvae that have hatched, but they're still climbing around on the outside before they dig into the middle of the apple. So it's important that you get the timing right. And you can monitor with traps. So there are traps like this that are baited with a female hormone. And so the males will be flying in there. So you can tell when the adult moths are present. And then you know, okay, they fly around for about a week and then they start mating and then they start laying eggs. And those eggs take so long to hatch. So you can time your spraying properly. Okay? It does no good to spray for these things before they've hatched, right? So that's one of the really big challenges is that if you go to the store, you'll find stuff called fruit tree spray, and it's both a fungicide and insecticide on there, and it'll say hey, every 7 days. Well, if your target insect isn't hatched yet, you're just wasting, right? It's useless. So you've got this small window. It's usually mid-May, and then late July for the second generation that sometimes comes out, and that will tell you when to spray. But the other thing is, again, all these apples that have fallen on the ground, you need to pick them up because every one of those apples might have a larva or two in them, and they're just going to be a problem for you next year. And then the last one, which is the worst, is apple maggot. And apple maggot is a tiny little fly, a 1/4 inch. It looks like a housefly in a way, but it's so tiny, you're not seeing the adults around. But they don't come out until late June to early July. Right now, they're still sleeping in the leaf litter and in the soil in the woods. And that's, again, why spraying now or spraying early, if you may not have codling moth, okay? Very likely don't have codling moth. It has to get in your area, okay? You may or may not have apple maggot, but what you have to do is look at your apples and look at the damage to see which pest do I have, and then know its life cycle and control accordingly. Okay, so these guys aren't out until late June or early July. So if you've never had codling moth, there's no reason to treat for it, which means you don't need to be spraying anything for insects until late June or early July at least. Okay, so these guys, the adults will feed on pollen and honeydew and other sticky stuff out there. Once they get out, they start laying their eggs in mid-July. And they emerge all year. Once they start coming out in late June, there's some of them that sleep in and they don't come out till later. So there's a steady supply of them coming out. They do the same kind of thing. They lay their eggs just under the skin, and then the larva hatches and they tunnel through for about 2 to 6 weeks. And then they will get to the ground and they will pupate, and then they're done. That particular one is going to wait until next year. But this is the damage that they cause, and you've all seen this, right? And it can be really bad. There will be like little dimples on the side, but there's these little brown trickles through the fruit where the larva has gone and damaged the fruit and it's turned brown. And we don't like these things, right? So the way you tell though is that these are tunneling through the flesh, whereas the codling moth, remember, goes into the core. So if you get enough of them in an apple, it's going to start rotting and looking like this, and that apple is going to fall to the ground again. So you need to
pick it up.
Pick it up, because if you just let them lay these fallen apples on the ground, just think every one of those has pests that are going to continue their development and cause you problems next year. So when they're ready, they crawl out, they go down into the soil, and they pupate for next year. So with apple maggot, there are a couple of traps that are very effective, not to control them so much, but to monitor for them so that you know when they're out there. And they will have good years and bad years, just like everything else, depending on the weather. So these yellow traps will start catching the adults, and you look at them, they'll catch other things too, not just apple maggot, other stuff that lands on them. So make sure that you identify them as apple maggots, and then you know when to start spraying. Okay. And then after, they'll be out flying around for a week or so and mating and stuff. When they're ready to lay their eggs, these red spheres are useful because when they're ready to lay their eggs, they look for that red apple-shaped thing and they go to it by sight. And what this is basically a red ball full of sticky stuff. So they go for it, they get stuck. They don't get to lay their eggs on your apples. So if you have just one tree or so, you can hang a couple of those red spheres in your tree and you'll probably catch most of them, but it's not 100% sure. So usually traps are used for monitoring to know when they're about and when you need to be spraying or whatever. Okay? Yeah.
Which pest is causing like the apples to get like really deformed and pitted? Like this,
Yep, it's mostly apple maggot. So see how it's deformed
Yeah.
here and stuff? And it might also be apple scab. So,
Sorry, one more question.
Yeah.
Where do you get the spray?
okay, hold that thought
Okay.
just briefly, okay? Because here we go, we're over time already, sorry. So the apple scab is really the only disease. You'll hear about cedar apple rust. That's not a concern whatsoever. That just causes a few spots on leaves, but cedar apple rust only is out there landing on the apple trees like 2 weeks ago, and there's no fruits out there. Cedar apple rust does not bother the fruits. It just causes some leaf spots. It's cosmetic. So we don't worry about that one. Apple scab is the only fungal disease that we really worry about. And this is going to be happy right now because of all this rain we've been having. Fungus needs water. It needs wet leaves or wet fruit in order for the fungal spores to germinate. So last year we didn't have much apple scab at all around because it was so dry. This year we're starting like giving it a nice boost here. So it survives in leaf litter. Oops. And it's most severe in cool, wet years. And this will cause spots on the leaves, but it will also cause lesions on the fruit that look like this, like scabs, hence its name. Okay. So this is what the leaf spots will look like, and those brown areas will get bigger as the year goes on. The problem with scab is, like cedar apple rust is a one-time thing. It's right in spring when the galls come off the cedars and poof. Apple scab can reinfect all year long if conditions are right. So if it dries up and we're not getting wet, a lot of rain, new infections will cease. But if it's continuously adequately wet, we can get in new infections all year long. So this starts right after the leaves are emerging. So it's like starting now. It's like getting out there. And as I said, these leaf spots will get bigger and then they'll send off spores that can land on the fruit when the fruit is this big and damage the fruit later on in the year. Remember, with all fungus on any of the plants, okay, it has to be prevented. You cannot cure a fungus. Okay, you have to prevent it in the first place. So heavily infected fruits might look like, I don't know if this is what you were talking about, your fruit looks like. Okay, so if it gets really bad like this, I mean, it can get really ugly and stuff. And of course, these are gonna fall to the ground where you should, okay, pick them up, because this is gonna give off spores, okay? So apple scab is the reason why you buy a disease-resistant tree or variety. This is the disease that we want it to be resistant to. So there are varieties that are resistant. The biggest thing is we want to promote good air circulation with that open pruning, not planting things too close together. If you've got a nice breezy spot in your yard, that's the place to plant your tree, and then cleaning up fallen fruits as well as leaves, because those leaves with those spots on it, that's where the disease, the spores are going to overwinter, and now they're blowing in the air. Okay, so these are your 3 major pests, and you need to identify them before you know how to control them. Now, with traps, as I mentioned earlier, they are really, really, really useful to tell if you've got a pest there in the first place, but they are mostly for monitoring, not for controlling. The exception is that the red sticky spheres, these things can significantly reduce apple maggot populations because they catch a lot of them before they lay their eggs. But all it takes is one to lay its eggs on your apple and you've got a little tunnel through it, right? So, but it kind of depends on the situation. And remember that this sticky stuff eventually gets full of insects. So you need to redo these traps because if there's not enough sticky surface there, the new bugs aren't going to get stuck. Okay. And then you need to use insecticides when they're present. Now, I'm not going to tell you what insecticides use because there's a list. Okay. There are organic options out there but what you need to do is decide what your pest is and then just look it up. What is it susceptible to? So like neem oil is an organic pesticide. Pyrethrins are organic pesticides. Organic stuff typically doesn't have as long of a residual effect as chemical things, so you might need to spray it more often. But just make sure whatever you get on the label, make sure that it says controls apple maggot, controls codling moth. You have to have that insect listed there because not every insect is affected by every compound out there. Okay. So with codling moth, we're trying again to kill the larvae that are tiny and just crawling on the surface of the fruit before they get in. And with plum curculio and apple maggot, because they actually make a slit in the skin and put their egg underneath that, we're trying to kill the adults before they do that. Okay, so that's why the timing is so important. The sprays for apple scab have to be there before the spore germinates. And so right now, the leaves are just starting to come out. The recommendations would be to get out there and spray with a fungicide to prevent it. Because once the spore lands on the leaf, it will germinate. It'll send down a little, it's called a hostorium, but it's a little growth that goes into the leaf and starts sucking the sap out of the leaf. That's what the fungus lives on. Once it's in that leaf, you can't control it. Fungicides go on the surface so that when the spore lands, the spore dies and it doesn't germinate and get into the plant. Okay. So with fungicides, application times vary depending on the weather conditions. So again, on the label, it'll say it controls apple scab, and it'll say apply every 7 to 14 days. Well, if it's raining like this, you're going to want to put it on every 7 days. If it's dry, you can wait 14 days to put it on. So, so you do make that decision a little bit. Now, here's a apple pest management for home gardeners. And again, this is on the UW Extension website, and this will talk about all of these pests and the timing and everything that I've talked about. And there's also a chart on there that says what timing for spraying for what things. Now, there will also be dormant oil stuff on there, but that's for mites and stuff that you don't have a problem with, trust me, and they don't affect the fruit. But it'll also tell like active ingredients on things, so that you know what to do when you go to the store. The thing is, again, try to avoid going to Fleet Farm and buying the thing that says fruit tree spray, because that's going to have both fungicide and insecticides in it. But as I just told you, you're treating at different times for these things. And you don't want to be put, like right now, you need to be spraying for apple scab, but the pollinators are out. You don't want an insecticide mixed in with that, or you're going to kill all your bees and stuff. So try to just get the fungicide or the insecticide that's needed. And if you have a variety that's disease resistant, even in this kind of rain, you may not even need to be spraying a fungicide. Okay. Few little spots here and there aren't a problem. You don't have to have perfect stuff. Now the other thing, yeah.
One thing too, what about your ornamental apple trees, yours like your crab apple you talked about? Should you be spraying those if they're nearby your other apple trees? If they might,
That's a great question. If you have a crab apple, they will get the same diseases. Except the apples themselves are usually too small to support these insects.
okay,
Okay, so the insects aren't so much a problem, but if you have a susceptible crab apple, it will get apple scab and it'll get yucky looking leaves and stuff. And yes, then you'd want to like rake up those leaves because that can be a source of apple scab
right.
fungus. The thing is that apple scab spores are all over in the wind. It's pretty hard to avoid them. So, but yep, that's a really good point. So the other thing that you can do is create a barrier. So if you can create a barrier so that when this apple maggot fly lays there, it can't make that slit in the skin and lay its egg, or the spore can't get to that skin, then you have no diseases or insects. Okay. And there's a couple of things that you can do. One that's been around for a long, long time in organic orchards is kaolin clay. It's a super, super fine clay. It's usually sold by the brand name Surround. And you mix it with water and you spray it and you cover your fruit. And it creates this layer of clay on there so the insects and the spores can't get to the skin of the apple. And it's very effective, but it washes off in the rain, so you got to reapply. And then, of course, you have to wash your apple before you eat it because there's a little layer of clay on it. But it's been around for a long time. And then the other thing that's really gaining ground is bagging your apples. And basically, what you do is you laugh, but it is okay. And it sounds tedious, but here's the beauty of it. So once the petals all fall and the apples are just tiny, about the size of a dime or a nickel, you go out there and you take a peek at them and you make sure there's not that little crescent shaped thing in there from the plum curculio that I showed you that starts early. And if you've got a perfect little apple in there, I made up this little thing with a Christmas ornament just to show how you do it. But you take a bag, they make bags specifically for this, or you can go to the dollar store and buy 1,000 sandwich bags for $1. And you put your apple in it, you zip it, you put a staple on either side because we know we can't trust those zipper things, right? So that apple is inside. You cut the corner off so that any condensation can drain out, and you let your apple grow in that bag all summer long. And you never have to spray anything. This is how you get the perfect organic apple. And if you have just 1 or 2 trees in your backyard, especially if you have a kid to help hand you the stapler and the bags, you can bag 60 apples an hour. And how many fresh apples do you actually eat in a year? Okay. So, but then you're done. You never have to be out there spraying. You never have to be out there picking up fallen fruit. You never have to be biting into an apple and getting a worm. Okay, it's becoming super, super popular. So really look into this. If you, like I say, only got a couple of apple trees in your yard, this is really, really good. You just have to explain to your neighbors what's going on. Okay, so this is the website again for Extension that has a whole lot more information on growing fruits and apples and stuff that will get you, in writing specifics. Questions?
It doesn't seem like you can reuse the plastic if you're stapling it.
You can if you're careful, but yeah, but again, if they're $1 for 1,000 of them. But the thing is that, not everybody likes plastic and you don't necessarily, but they make paper bags and they make nylon bags too that are made specifically for this. So if you just do a little Google search for bagging apples for insect control sort of a thing, there's some that are from Japan that are real popular and common, and then you can reuse those for multiple years. This is just like more handy. So
There was one question online. Do we wait until the tree is established to prune, or should we prune right after planting a bare root tree?
Great question. In most cases, you're not going to prune a newly planted tree for at least a couple of years because you need it to grow up. You want to have as many leaves on that tree because that's what's doing the photosynthesis and making the energy for the tree. So in most cases, you want it to just grow for a couple of years, and then you'll start topping off that central leader and creating those horizontal branches. Okay, everybody, apple pie by fall, right? Thank you.